This is Ashley Newby, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, cultural workers, political organizers, and everyone in between in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. Today, we have the absolute pleasure of talking with Dr. Marisa J. Fuentes, Presidential Term Chair in African American History and Associate Professor of History in Women's and Gender and Sexuality Studies at Rutgers University. Dr. Fuentes is an interdisciplinary scholar interested in the histories of gender, slavery, the Caribbean, and Black Atlantic worlds. She is the author of the award-winning book, Dispossessed Lives, Enslaved Women, Violence, and the Archive, which won book prizes from the Association of Black Women Historians, the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians, and the Barbara T. Christian Best Humanities Book Prize from the Caribbean Studies Association. She is also co-editor of Scarlet and Black, Slavery and Dispossession in Rutgers History, Volume 1, 2, 3, and the Slavery and the Archive special issue in the History of the Present. In March 2023, Dr. Fuentes was elected to the Society of American Historians, which honors literary distinction in the writing of history and biography. Most recently, in April 2024, Dr. Fuentes was elected as a member of the American Antiquarian Society. Her recent publications include The Afterword with Sarah Haley and Sadia Hartman's second edition of Scenes of Subjection, Slavery's Archive and the Matter of Black Atlantic Lives, Genres of History and the Practice of Loss, Attending to Silence in Hazel Carby's Imperial Intimacies, A Tale of Two Islands, and Attending to Black Death, Black Women's Bodies in the Archive and the Afterlife of Captivity, A Reflection. Her next book, Refused Bodies, Disposable Lives, A History of the Human and Transatlantic Slave Trade, explores the connections between capitalism, the transatlantic slave trade, and the disposability of Black lives in the 17th and 18th century. For the 2024-2025 academic year, Dr. Fuentes will be a member, or is a member of the Institute for the Advanced Study School of Historical Studies in Princeton, New Jersey. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
I'm so excited to talk to you. So let's dive into how you got into Black studies.
This is a great question because I feel like I came at it kind of sideways in the sense that as an undergrad, I wanted to major in African American history. But at my institution, my undergrad institution, which was UC Santa Cruz, they didn't actually have a major in African American history, just American history. But I had great advisors that told me to take classes on Black subject in every discipline. So I took sociology, literature, performance studies. And what happened is, though I did major in American history, I actually got an interdisciplinary education in Black studies. And it was, and I say sideways because it was like inadvertent, right? But what it did do is open my mind to a range of questions and a range of disciplinary positions one could take when studying Black life in the diaspora. And I was always interested also in the diaspora because I studied abroad in Ghana. I spent time in the South Carolina Sea Islands doing my senior thesis research. So I wanted to make sure that I always kept a kind of global scope in mind when I was interested in following the development of Black life throughout the world.
Thank you. I think it's so interesting that you were able to get this interdisciplinary perspective, even though you were focused or your major was history. And obviously that definitely comes into play and influences the work that you do. What keeps you committed to Black studies at this point?
You know, I just am a huge fan of my graduate program at Berkeley, which was African American Studies, and the PhD program is African Diaspora Studies. And what I learned there, I could not have learned in a history department. Critical, cutting edge, questions about knowledge production, about Black lives, both historical and contemporary, about structures that subject Black lives, but also how Black people have and do fight back to
Mhm.
these oppressive structures. I was nurtured to ask questions that weren't confined to a particular discipline. And that is why I remain committed to Black studies, um, because it will always be about what is the best tool for understanding Black life in whatever frame I'm interested in. And Black studies allows me to do that, right? When other disciplines might move us to the periphery or move my questions to the periphery for whatever reason. I am just absolutely dedicated to keeping a Black studies mindset as I approach any question that I'm interested in.
So, building on that, you're very much committed and influenced by Black studies and in particular diaspora studies. But you do operate, or your job is technically in history, right? So how do you situate yourself disciplinarily, particularly when the methods that you use go outside of the scope of like historical archival approved and traditional methods?
Yes, it's a great question. So I will say that I did not expect to find myself in a history department. It was surprising in many respects because I have a degree in African American studies, and traditionally history departments don't hire folks with degrees in Black studies. So I was surprised, and I will say too that the department, their pedagogy, the questions that they ask, has influenced how I've thought and developed my own work. But I think at the end of the day, and this is one question I think Black studies programs grapple with, is do you choose a discipline within Black studies to
Yeah.
align yourself with or to understand it so that at least you could speak from the inside of it, right? With
Mhm.
studies, with sort of questions that are framed through an interdisciplinary inquiry about critical Black studies, right? So I would say that I did choose a disciplinary frame when I was in grad school so that I would be recognizable, or I had the expertise to ask questions about the historical field because I was grounded within it
Mhm.
also, right? So there's something you tell your students, like you could critique traditions and methods, but you have to know the field in order to do that, right?
Yeah.
So I'm situated in a history department. I teach, Caribbean history and those kinds of classes from a historical lens, but I'm also always asking questions about the production of the archive, right? And particularly around, I get to teach a class on Caribbean slavery, right? So I ask the students critical questions about representation in these archives, about how Black lives are distorted, right? And so I actually think that those questions are situated in Black studies still,
Mhm.
but I can bring it to bear on his traditional archives in a way that I think I want my students to pick up on and to continue to ask those kinds of critical questions.
So, building on that, can you speak a little bit about the methodology that, or the methods that you used in Dispossessed Lives? Because one, it was very different than what people coming from who go to the archives as historians normally do. And it provided a way to think about doing history in a different way. So, if you could talk a little bit about that, particularly because you are bringing it from, like, you brought Black studies to history and said, "Nah, y'all don't do this right. So let's
Right.
think about how to do this better."
Right. I want to be very forthright in this, in that it was a risk for me to do this in a history department.
Mhm.
And it wasn't easy, um, because people don't like change. And as sort of quote unquote liberal as my department is in many respects, you have to really make it legible to them so that they understand, right? And my going into the project and developing methods was because I felt I had to. Like, I had to. I was angry that I sat in the archives for 22 months and I didn't have one source by a Black woman from her words or her perspective, not one. And this has a lot to do with the archive I was looking at. It's the British Colonial Archive. We could, there's a whole another podcast to be done on the different archives of that render Black life legible. But this archive made it absolutely impossible for me to just tell a traditional story about Black women enslaved in the Caribbean. And I was so angry about it because it wasn't just that they didn't have a voice that came through, but they were being described by the very people that brutalized them. And again, I was angry. Like, how do we accept this? And I was being told by traditional historians, but that's all there is. So either you can't write this book because there's not enough information, or you have to take the authoritative word of the archive, which is these white men and women, and that's what you have to tell the story. And I refused. And I think, to bring it back to Black studies, refusal is part of that, right? It's part of, refusing the rules of a system that we did not build. And so I just made a decision to think hard about how I can tell these stories that might not be in a way that's traditional, but that does justice to the subjects. And again, justice is part of our field, right?
Yeah.
An ethical attention to Black lives that have been brutalized and violated, so that you're not merely reproducing that for other people to consume. So I sat with these women that I found in the archive, and I think the thinking took a long time. It took longer than the writing of it. Each chapter I had to figure out a way in, and I had to figure out a way to hold them in view, while keeping in mind that I couldn't merely reproduce, and I had to be creative in that retelling. So I will also say that, my advisors encouraged me also, who were also in Black studies, both sort of within it and then peripheral to it, but doing Black studies in an English department, for example, who encouraged me to love writing, and that writing is the method also. And they don't teach us that necessarily in a more traditional discipline. I think that it is actually the poetics of language that you can use to as a method, right? To take care of the subjects that you're writing about and to convey their perspective in a particular way. So I would argue that each chapter has a different method because the sources were different and they required a different way in. But I also it was a kind of decision to fight back from what I was being told by traditional historians. And I said, I refuse what you're saying, because what you're saying is a way to keep Black women and Black people silent still, right? So I took a risk.
I think that many people appreciate the risk that you took, and providing a example of how to do this work differently and how to look at the archive differently and take what's there and move beyond that in a way that, as you said, does justice to the voices that have been silenced and made peripheral within colonial archives as a whole. I want to ask you a little bit more about the writing as a method, because I think that that's super important, and it is something I don't think that we talk about enough. And particularly coming from a Black studies perspective and in Black studies as a field, like, language is so important in Black studies,
Yeah.
right? It's in a lot of times, I find that students have a preconceived notion about, like, what academic writing is supposed to be, what it's supposed to look like, that it's not supposed to have the poetics, that it's supposed to be dry, right? But Black studies pushes against that. In thinking about your writing as a method, I
Yeah.
think also helps to push against that.
Yeah.
How do you impress that upon your students?
Right. I think this is such a great thing to dig into. And going back to kind of your first question, part of what brought me into Black studies as a field was Black women writers.
Mhm.
Like, that's literally how I came to self-knowledge, actually, right? Alice Walker, Toni Morrison, all of these Black women writers that I read as I was leaving high school. And they are beautiful writers,
Oh.
right? They are, so I think part of it was I was unwittingly training myself in prose, in a particular kind of prose. And so there's that. But I also think that I have learned this from, so say Saidiya Hartman, who co-chaired my dissertation. It should be kind of obvious. But I learned from her writing,
Mhm.
and how her writing evolved over the course of her work. It is very different in Scenes of Subjection than it is in Wayward Lives, right? Like,
Mhm.
it's creative nonfiction by the time we get to Wayward Lives and through Lose Your Mother. And so I'm learning to now describe the method as a performance of the poetics of the theory. So if
Mm.
I have a theoretical question in mind, how do I demonstrate that without simply telling you this is what it is, but actually perform the poetics of the theory? And one example I would give you is in the last chapter of Dispossessed Lives. And I don't know if people have these conversations about that chapter. It was really difficult to write because it was such violent material,
Mhm.
brutally violent material, that I felt really, really vexed about reproducing. So what I decided to do was, again, and I say this in the chapters, change the perspective by changing pronouns in the writing. So now it's she sees, right? She felt a blow on her back. Like, all of that actually changes the way that you as the reader come in
Yeah.
to this particular archival piece that was never meant to tell you what her perspective was, right? So there's like a writerly or a literary device that you can use to change perspective. But what I also did is I have 3 vignettes or 4 vignettes. Like, I started with her perspective, and then in each vignette, the archive comes encroaching in. So by the end, it's full on the language of the archive. So you can see the layers, right? And the process of writing that goes on. That does something epistemological. It changes
Yeah.
our what we take away from it, right? So that's kind of talking about the writing as a method. But I also want to, I think this conversation I've been hearing lately is from some grad students. Well, think about Hartman's critical fabulation. Well, there's no archive, so let's just make it up. And actually, that's not at all what it is.
No.
And in order to do that kind of writing, you have to be very, very, very grounded in an archive
Yeah.
and in the historiography that
Yeah.
attends to that. And there's no fiction involved. I think I would be very adamant to say, in no part of my book do I ever say, other than like a physical feeling on one's skin that I have evidence of,
Mhm.
what these women thought or felt, because I don't know that. And I could never know. That's what's
Yeah.
taken from us,
Yeah.
right? So you can't fill it in, because that's also unethical to do that, right? You have to really struggle with with and against the archive in order to do the work that we're doing.
Mm-hmm. So the struggling with and against the archive to do that work, which you describe in the beginning of the book as along the bias.
Yes.
Yes, along the bias. I think that that's so important, and I think that bringing up or the misunderstanding of critical fabulation, which happens, like people misunderstand things all the time,
Yeah.
but like not understanding the work that goes into that and any kind of writing that you're doing, writing against the bias or along the bias of the archives themselves, and the toll that takes, I think is huge, right? What are there processes that you think are important when you're doing this type of work to keeping yourself together, like being able to get through that violence to excavate voices that have been silenced?
Yes. It's a question that comes up a lot about how do you take care of yourself when you've done this kind of deep dive in this particular archive for so long. And I have sort of a couple things to say about it. One is I'm for some reason, I have found I can do this work and sit with it for long periods of time, not because I have like an immunity to it or all of that. I certainly would say to take breaks and walk away because you have to, right? I don't watch violence against Black people on any movie or TV. I don't try to read about it in our present day because I can't actually manage it. Like I can't take it on. I already do the work in the archive. But I also think that it's not for everyone. I don't think that everyone can be a trauma surgeon and go out every day and try to heal people with gunshot wounds. Like I don't think I'm not capable. I'm not going to do that, right? Because I don't have that makeup as a person. But I can do this other thing, right? And so I think there's a part of it that values the study of Black lives. And we need to figure out a way for all of us to contribute. So I do understand why people are looking for ways that people resisted. People are looking for hope. They are looking for ways that people fought back. And we need that. We absolutely need that. And we also need people to talk about the impossibility of incarceration, right? Like the suffering that goes on inside, like and outside. We need all of this. And so I don't have a kind of strategy for self-care necessarily, other than I know my limits of what I can and cannot consume and take in. And I'm real clear about that. And I don't, but I also understand why my senior colleagues wrote a book about slavery and then didn't ever again.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because they needed to move on to something that wasn't as painful and heavy. But I think we all have something to contribute to this, to the understanding of this history.
I mean, I think that the point about knowing your limits is important, though, right? And particularly in this moment, with all of the things that are going on, right? If your research is, or you're going to be rooted and focused on archives that are inherently violent, that you have to balance that out some way.
Yes.
And know when you need to walk away from the archive, but also know what you can and cannot handle consuming in your everyday life.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a very important reminder when there are so many things, particularly with the 24-hour news cycle and social media that's always coming at us, that like you have to remove yourself from that to do this work.
Yes.
Then it's important that you know that.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And social media gives me particular anxieties, which is why I'm not on at all. Yeah.
I know more and more people who are doing that because it's too much.
Yeah.
And it doesn't stop.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also think, one thing I try to encourage my students to do is to read. The more time you're off of it, the more time you have to read. And reading is wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah. That's very true. Maybe I'll make that suggestion to my students. Take a break from social media and read for
Yeah.
class. That'd be great.
Yes, for class. Yes.
Speaking of students, how do you feel that Black Studies informs your pedagogy and how you approach teaching and interacting with both graduate and undergraduate students?
So I teach history courses for the most part in the history department. And I've been really lucky to be able to just stay within my lane and teach early Caribbean history and histories of Caribbean slavery. And I love teaching them. I love these classes because they're drawing students from not just history, but other fields and other disciplines that have kind of Caribbean history themselves, and they come with their curiosities about their families and their past. And so there's a kind of real buy-in and engagement there. What I bring when I bring Black Studies to bear, it is, again, it's this balance between giving them a strong foundation on the historical trajectory of this history, while also raising questions about the production and representation of Black life within this. Right? You're always going to have documents and narratives coming from Europeans. But what do you do with that, right? For me, those are Black Studies questions about taking them apart and questioning the veracity of these sources, and questioning, well, how do you write with it, inside a silence in the archive? And I do exercises with them that challenges them to find an archival piece and analyze it, right? And a lot of what comes back is I cannot find something written by an enslaved person in this early period. And I said, okay, so what do you have? And let's work with that. So again, it's really bringing questions in to challenge them to push back, to be critical thinkers, right? Black Studies is all about critical thinking.
Yeah.
And learning to kind of really apply critical thinking skills on information, whether it's in contemporary media or in the archive, right? So those are the kinds of things that I maintain as core to teaching history classes, with critical questions about knowledge production, but particularly related to Black lives.
Thank you. I think that the knowledge production piece is so important, again, right now, especially with understanding the motivations, the purpose, the context within which something is produced, which can also speak to the silences that are there, right? The silences are there. They didn't care. Right. They weren't going to have the perspective of an enslaved person from this particular time period because it was irrelevant.
Right.
But even thinking about the things that are available and why they are composed and maintained in a particular way, I think is also very interesting.
Yes.
Down to the physical archive itself, right?
Right.
So thank you for that. I always get all these thoughts when our guests say stuff and I'm like, okay, but yeah, no, but thank you. So what interests you most about the past of Black Studies?
You know what I'm so fascinated by is some of the pioneers of Black Studies. I mean, we know that Black Studies emerged out of student struggle, right? And a demand to have representation in intellectual work in colleges. I want to learn about my people. I want to learn about our past, because so much of it had been denied or hidden, right? So like I'm fascinated about the movement aspect of the emergence of the field. I think that that's something that we can all still learn from, particularly now as we're fighting to keep Black studies as part of our curriculum, right? That it was students that made these demands and the students took the risk and students demanded it's their education, right? So they have a lot of power. And I think understanding that is really critical right now, empowering students to fight back in particular ways. But what I'm also interested is, and I'm thinking about some of the pioneers, and I was thinking about these questions and I'm like, why am I coming up with only men in terms of pioneers in Black studies from before it was Black studies, right? Like Du Bois and Carter G. Woodson and John Hope Franklin, right? But so I'm like, well, there's gotta be, obviously, there is. But I say that to say Du Bois is a particular scholar who is constantly drawn upon now.
Yeah.
And I think that's fascinating, right? His work is timely no matter what era we're in, because the struggle is still over racism, right? And the to say the downpression of Black people on a global scale. And he was a diaspora scholar too. So like I find that really interesting. But what I would say too, if we're thinking about the past of Black studies, Black feminists are critical and have been critical. So I think again of like the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s, we would not have critical race theory without Kimberly Crenshaw, right? Like, so these Black women scholars, and many of whom I continue to draw on in my own work, I think Black feminist scholars are asking questions that are just pushing the field. And I would say even pushing the field of slavery studies into new territory. So I think that those things, both the activism and then the pioneers, who have actually built something for us, right, that we could draw on, but also create anew.
So, and this goes hand in hand with that, right? But what interests you or excites you about where we are right now and where the field is going?
I mean, I would say excited and concerned at the same time, right? I think I have hope in the potential of scholars coming out of Black studies and, writing and thinking and creating, because Black studies is also, as we know, like art and all kinds of art production, visual culture, music, like all of that by young people being harnessed and to continue to create content for us. But I'm also worried a bit about a couple things, and I would say that one of the things I am concerned about is the way that slave and slavery has been spoken about as a metaphor for something in contemporary Black life. And I think we need to dig deep down and do more work for the future, because I'm concerned that that's an ahistorical evocation that is not grounded in an actual condition of enslavement. And the more we say that as a metaphor, the less we actually understand what the struggle was. Right back in the past. So I would like history to remain part of it, right? Historical studies. And again, we have plenty of examples of people who do historical work that's not traditional, right? That takes critical questions in Black studies and uses the archive to think through that. But also we need to fight. We need to fight. And I hope that I hope that our students have access to Black Studies.
Yeah.
I hope that Black Studies continues to be funded by institutions. And I hope that our students fight for it, right? And feel empowered enough and not hopeless. I know this time right now is absolutely overwhelming. But maybe if we remind them that it came out of struggle,
Yeah.
and a lot of sacrifice, and some of those students that struggled to have Black Studies programs didn't get to finish school.
Yeah.
Right? And so, like, there's just so much for us to be thankful for and to build on with those struggles.
And I think that those are very important reminders right now. And as we face the things that are happening and gear up to fight back.
Yes.
And maintain, because Black Studies it was here before it was institutionalized. It'll be here if institutionalization goes away.
Yes.
And acknowledging and recognizing that, like, just if it might look different, but that doesn't mean it's going anywhere. Like, as long as Black people are here,
Yes.
Black Studies is going to be here.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
thank you. Would you like to say anything about your current project?
Sure. Yeah. I've been working on a project that I think I would say continues to attend to people in the archive that are, I would call, impossible historical subjects. So I'm looking at, this weaves into the conversation we just had. I discovered a group of people that survived the Middle Passage and survived any passage of the Middle Passage. So it didn't matter where they were going in the Americas, but they arrived at a port and they couldn't be sold because they were dying. And the British called them refuse, so garbage, really. And they created, for the British and the French and the Portuguese and the Spanish, they created a problem. Because what do you do with people that aren't going to survive a sail? So you have to think about how much time one is in port after a long voyage. So I was interested in language about why would you call a group of people refuse?
Yeah.
Right? And I've discovered that that name is a word that is found in every single colonial language, a European colonial language, to describe a captive, an African captive who survived the Middle Passage but gets to a port and is unsellable or sold for so little, right? So I'm finding them in the archive, and it literally says, so-and-so purchased 1 man, 2 women, 1 child, almost dead. What does it mean for us to consider that this is also part of the spectrum of Black captivity, right? So there's that. We haven't even thought about them because they're always how they've calculated the slave trade, 12 million and more. It's the and more that is so easy to pass over because they think, oh, well, they're dead, so there's nothing to say. In fact, they produce a lot of meaning about racial capitalism that produces humans as waste, right? What gender means at that moment that they're being decided that they are no longer man, woman, child. They're an object that's decomposing, right? There's all these terms that we use both in critical Black studies. This is where my work gets like really back to this, and in history, the way that we understand and write about slavery, that this group of people that has been so discarded and overlooked actually push back on all the concepts, or these 5 concepts that I'm thinking about in both critical Black studies and slavery. And we have to come up with new language on, these concepts with this group of people that I'm trying to hold on to long enough to attend to them and to bring them to others' attention.
Well, thank you. That sounds like an amazing and important project. Like you said, the and more is not talked about, and that's wow. So thank you for doing that work.
Absolutely.
And I'm very much looking forward to when that book comes out as well. Is there anything else you would like to add?
I just want to thank you for this opportunity to think about my training, actually, and my commitment to the field. It's really, really important. Like I said, and we're thinking about ways to battle through this erasure and defunding, and I think it's really important to continue to have these conversations.
Well, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate your generous answers and insight, as well as the work that you continue to do. So, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.